Hi, do I just click onto my first slide here? Great, thank you. Hello, so I'm Orla Delaney. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, but prior to this, I worked as a senior research fellow for about 9 months at the National Gallery in London. And so this paper is about the work that I did there alongside Joe Padfield, who I believe is in the audience here, though not presenting with me today, but he will be presenting later, so make sure you catch that. Cultural heritage institutions, particularly the departments of those institutions concerned with the scientific examination of artworks and artifacts, gather and store vast quantities of data about their collections. This data includes detailed provenance information, full documentation records, images of samples that might be taken from artworks, and the results of any examinations that are conducted using X-radiography, mass spectrometry, and other analytical techniques. This wealth of information is rarely made available to researchers, and it's even less often made available in a usable, interoperable format. So this research provides a model for how that kind of data can be made significantly more accessible using a pair of National Gallery datasets as an example. This paper describes work undertaken as the National Gallery's contribution to the EU-funded SHOCK project. The majority of this work was completed between December 2020 and September 2021, though I believe that the project has only concluded in the last couple of weeks. And the work consisted of mapping 2 datasets that were previously assembled at the gallery to CIDOC-CRM. The aim of this presentation is both to describe how the mapping exercise was approached and conducted, and to give instruction to future researchers who want to replicate our approach, given that CIDOC-CRM is still in relatively early stages of its adoption by cultural heritage institutions, particularly in this kind of context, where the data is very scientific and very detailed. So the acronym FAIR, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, provides an important guiding principle for this research. So the goal of this research, as stated in the SHOCK project, was to make the datasets fair, and we used CIDOC-CRM as a means of going about that. So a little bit about FAIR. It was first defined in 2016. The FAIR principles dictate that open data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and they provide specific guidelines for how those conditions might be met. In broad terms, findability refers to the ability of both humans and computers to locate a dataset and the individual pieces of data within. This is achieved by indexing data in an appropriate searchable resource, providing persistent identifiers, or PIDs, for each piece of data, and ensuring that rich metadata is present alongside the dataset. Accessibility is about ensuring that any protocol for querying and manipulating data conforms to a well-documented, widely used standard, and that metadata can persist beyond the deprecation of the rest of the dataset. Interoperability is concerned with the integration of datasets, both with other compatible datasets and with applications that might draw on that dataset to present content to users. To fulfill this criterion, data should be described using standardized systems of knowledge representation, like CIDOC-CRM, and connected where possible to vocabularies that are themselves fair. Finally, reusability is a set of procedural boxes that have to be ticked so that a user knows how they can use a dataset from both a technical and a legal perspective. So that means choosing a license and making that available, and it also means documenting the dataset so that the processes that we do with it can be replicable. So in a way, this presentation is part of the process of making our dataset fair. And it also means that data's provenance information needs to be accessible. So taken together, these are a sound set of structuring guidelines for a cultural heritage dataset, but they're also an ontological approach that prioritizes persistence and openness. In other words, an approach that better aligns digital technologies and academic ways of working. So 2 datasets that were already held by the National Gallery became the test cases for our project. The first one is known as the Raphael Research Resource. I refer to it sometimes as the OR dataset, and created in 2007. It describes paintings by Raphael that are held in the collection of the National Gallery, as well as additional entries from the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Musée Condé, and others. In total, the dataset describes 27 paintings and contains full resolution images of each painting, as well as images and samples taken during various scientific examination processes. Each painting within the dataset is richly documented, and the dataset contains full provenance records to the extent that they were available at the time of its creation. These range from short curatorial descriptions to scholarly articles to scans, but not transcriptions, of physical folders known as conservation dossiers, which describe all of the conservation procedures undergone by a given painting. Prior to the start of this research project, the ORR dataset was already presented in linked data format, and it formed the backend dataset for a web resource, which you can see on my slide. However, the ontology that was used to describe Raphael was bespoke to the National Gallery. It was created by my colleague Joe in the late 2000s, about 2007, using terminology and vocabularies not common to other similar datasets. So the dataset couldn't conform to FAIR standards unless it was mapped to a more widely used ontology, which provided a series of unusual challenges and has now enabled the development of a couple of best practice standards for updating older linked datasets. The second gallery dataset that was used for this project is known as the Grounds database. This was developed in 2018 as part of Hyperion CH, another EU project, and it's a traditional relational database. It's got 44 tables, and it describes preparation layers in 16th century Italian paintings. So these are the layers that went on before the paint that you see. And those paintings include the Raphael collection, and they also include data from the Prado, the Derner Institute in Munich, and Katz in Copenhagen, among other partners. And the dataset now contains information about 266 paintings across those institutions' collections. The majority of the data points in the database describe cross-section samples taken from those paintings. They detail their precise locations on the painting's surface, as well as observations about their material makeup and descriptions of each layer's colouring and pigmentation. This relational database was presented within a bespoke web resource, again one that you can see the greeting page to there on the left, which enabled users to query the data. However, this was not conceived of as a FAIR resource, rather it was a resource that could be made to conform to FAIR standards at a later date. So as such, the resource doesn't contain any PIDs and is not currently open to users outside of the National Gallery. So the decision to use Python as the primary technology for our mapping was largely a practical one. From early on, it was clear that the complexities inherent to both datasets demanded a custom approach and would not allow us to use existing mapping technologies. Python was chosen both because of existing proficiencies within the mapping team and because of the RDF-lib package that's in Python. RDF-lib is an open source library within Python whose functionality includes local storage, querying, and creation of RDF graphs, as well as OWL-based inferencing and documentation. Crucially for this project, RDF-lib's functionality is such that both sets of inputs could be standardized to such an extent that the overarching code structure as well as specific functions could persist across both mappings. So we were able to use a lot of our code both to map Raphael and to map the Grounds dataset. So that decreased the workload and increased the eventual interoperability of the target datasets. Python's native data science capabilities also made it a particularly suitable language in which to conduct this migration. The open source library Pandas is an extremely widely used data science tool which allows users to transform datasets into data frames and load them directly into Python, from where various operations can be performed in a few lines of code. This became essential to the mapping of the Grounds database in particular, as it enabled SQL views that were created in the MySQL database where Grounds is stored to be directly imported into Python, drastically reducing processing time by decreasing the number of database calls that were necessary to access Grounds. All the images that are linked within this dataset, and there are a lot, are fully compliant with the International Image Interoperability Framework, IIIF. IIIF is a protocol that ensures that the images of from an art historical provenance are themselves fair. It provides detailed metadata and maximum quality display technology that is entirely shareable without the need for users to download images. The SHOCK project ran alongside another AHRC-funded gallery project that address the practical usage of IIIF and aim to increase uptake among museum professionals, and this piece of research was able to make good use of the IIIF project's outputs. For IIIF purposes, image metadata is grouped in documents known as manifests, which form the back-end datasets for compliant image viewers. Our dataset and our output interface is designed such that manifests can be created on the fly from user-defined inputs. If a user wants to attach or to see all the paintings ascribed to a particular artist, or all of the copies of a particular painting, or all of the documentation images that we have that surround a specific cross-section sample, a IIIF compliant manifest can be generated within seconds to describe and serve this data. The use of IIIF also increases the reusability and interoperability of our datasets, as they can be referenced and reproduced on external websites and apps, simply through the inclusion of our IIIF code in these websites' backends. And the IIIF outputs of our project are all presented using OpenSeaDragon Image Viewer, which I believe Joe will talk about in more detail in his presentation later today. From this project's inception, it was clear that PIDs would be a crucial part of making any heritage science dataset fair. So globally unique, actionable, and persistent, these identifiers provide a citable reference for any given entity in a dataset, increasing both findability and interoperability. The National Gallery is in the process of migrating its PID system to a new, stable URL and changing the structure of its PIDs at the same time, so our project had to anticipate these changes before their official implementation. It was also expected that our project would necessitate the creation of new PIDs. For example, PIDs to refer to ephemeral entities like specific historical events and time spans, rather than objects in the gallery's collection. For this reason, the project's approach to PIDs is designed to be reactive to the gallery's system, first querying the gallery PID API before inserting a placeholder PID into a private MySQL database that we would query throughout the rest of the migration process. This allowed our project to proceed independently of the work that was being done at the same time on PIDs, while enabling it to easily conform to that work's standards at a later date, as well as creating a stable list of entities that would need new PIDs when the time came. In the meantime, the temporary PIDs that were produced by our system are all fully compliant with FAIR and resolve to gallery URLs. It was during this stage that the governing principles of the task's use of PIDs versus blank nodes within CIDOC-CRM were established. In general, and throughout the work, PIDs are used as the main identifier for any given datum, and RDF's blank nodes are used in place of PIDs for data that was identified as less likely to be directly relevant to users beyond its function in the dataset. For example, paintings and other objects are given PIDs, but ephemeral quantities pertaining to them, such as their height and width, were assigned blank nodes. This relates to how semantic relationships are defined. An object would have a dimension, which would then have a value and a unit, etc. Users are expected to search for the dimension value in an object, rather than the dimension semantic node used to connect it to the object. The assumption made here was that users would query the dataset for objects in their own right, and might also search for example, the events of their production, the collection in which they are held, and other similar quantities, but would be less likely to search directly for more generic quantities such as dimensions, preferred identifier, or specific materials without them being directly connected to specific objects. This logic persisted throughout the work and went on to underpin both output datasets. So traditionally, a data mapping could be divided into two broad phases: a phase of ideation, in which the theoretical structure of the mapping is laid out, and an implementation phase. However, partially due to the constraints imposed by COVID-19, which necessitated that work be done entirely remotely, these phases were compounded and ideas were prototyped and coded simultaneously. This enabled outputs to be created on the fly that could then be passed into a Mermaid.js-based tool called the Dynamic Modeler, which Joe will talk about in more detail later, and presented for discussion over video call. This was intended as a substitute for post-its and whiteboard scribbling that would ordinarily make up the ideation phase. Doing the mapping this way required a technical system to be put in place from the outset, so that the initial phases of the project focused on establishing both a methodology and a broad code structure. From there, different iterations of the mapping could be tested seamlessly by changing small amounts of code. Once the technology was chosen, the basic architecture of the mapping code needed to be set out. Within Python's RDF package, it is possible to load data into a construct known as a graph, which is an unsorted container that forms the basic structure for any set of RDF code. Graphs hold data in the form of triples, or in Python terms, tuples that resemble RDF triples. Data loaded into a graph can be queried locally using Sparkle or a Pythonic Sparkle-like set of commands, and manipulated before being passed into a new output graph. An output graph can also be built from data in any other format, as long as it is passed into the new graph in triplicate form. This functionality provided the basis for our project's code structure. Data is loaded into Python. A query isolates the relevant data for a particular part of the mapping by pulling, for example, all the data of RDF type painting, and new CIDOC-CRM triples are created to describe that part of the mapping and loaded into a new graph. From here, the data can be exported in common formats such as XML and Turtle and loaded into triple stores to continue development. The first of our datasets to be mapped was the Raphael research resource. The input for this mapping was an XML file containing the old Raphael dataset expressed in linked data format, but using that old ontology that was not itself fair. Full ontology documentation was also available. The basic relations described in the Raphael ontology are similar enough in nature to those described in the CRM. At the center of the ontology is the class RC12 painting, linked using the property RP24 has owner to an RC41 institution, as well as to an RC40 person by way of, for example, an RC32 production event. The use of events as a structuring principle is akin to their use in the CRM, in which no entity is ever presumed to be permanent, but rather is temporally bordered in the same way as it might be geographically bordered. This meant that the mapping, once begun, ought to be straightforward to complete. No significant restructuring of the data would be required to describe the same entities, though the CRM did require many more connections to be made than existed in the Raphael research resource. So our initial test mapping of a painting produced this broad code structure that would form the basis of the rest of our migration. First of all, a function called mapObject is called. This function queries the Raphael database to locate entities of RDF type RC12 painting from our old ontology, then loops through the results and queries the database again to find all the triples that those are the subject of, thereby creating a subset of the data that pertains only to those paintings. A PID is then generated for each painting, and the subset is looped through again to isolate the triples that hold specific information about this painting, its title, for example, or its measurements. Information from these subsets of subsets provides the inputs for functions such as create title triples, which uses these inputs to build CIDOC-CRM triples that are stored in a new graph. Each characteristic that requires mapping has a corresponding function like create title triples, and these triple creation functions are written to be relevant to various different parts of the mapping. For example, the same create location triples function might be called by all of mapObject, mapInstitution, and mapSample, creating outputs that follow the same pattern for each. This construct has an economizing effect, reducing duplication and making the mapping code more readable and more replicable. Some creative decisions had to be made to translate the spirit of the original dataset into the CRM. In particular, the Raphael dataset had made liberal use of a construct called a project category, which was a tagging system under which disparate entries were grouped. So these tags could be categories that were broad, like art history, or quite specific categories like photo micrographs or X-ray images. CIDOC-CRM lacks a direct means of dealing with loose semantic tagging, likely owing to the fact that that kind of tagging disrupts the linkedness of a dataset, parceling pieces of data out into broadly defined groups rather than mapping the connections between them. However, in the Raphael dataset, the categories did provide a neat way of navigating the user interface, which sought to display and compare images in groups or in AAAF manifests, so we needed to retain some of that logic. So for more specific tags, that was quite straightforward. An image tagged photo micrographs became an object measurement whose technique was photomicrography, and which produced the image in question. Broader image categories like art history were harder to replace with discretely defined relationships, and in these cases, the approach was either done away with or the relationship was turned into broader overarching ideas, as was done in the case of the provenance category. To describe provenance, a history event was created for each image in the collection. Any event that would have tagged provenance in the old dataset became a sub-entity of the history event, and documents that described a painting's provenance were linked to the history event using the property P70 documents. This approach transformed the tagging system of the old dataset into a useful means of creating specificity in the new one. Using IDs from the AAT, the techniques previously described using tags could easily be subsumed into the dataset itself and made into linkable pieces of information. A second approach to this issue created groups of images or texts that depicted a given painting. This provided a means of unifying all of the images related to one painting, which was an important aspect of the previous version of the research resource. The greatest challenge confronted in the mapping was the question of how to describe an image file in CRM. In the old Raphael dataset, images were treated purely as files and they were only connected to their subject using the property P40 is related to. CRM, however, demanded a more holistic view of the relationship between the image, the file, and the subject, a view that's expanded through the incorporation of the compatible model CRM-DIG. So CRM-DIG's remit is to describe the production of digital derivatives of a work, which is particularly useful for our project's use case of describing files as both semi-ephemeral versions of an image and actual computational structures that could be described using URIs and manifests. A file then was mapped both as an E24 physical human-made thing and as a D1 digital object. The CRM-DIG concept D3 formal derivation described the relationship between files as non-specific digital entities and their representations as pyramids or thumbnails. Blending basic CRM and CRM-DIG in this way allowed files to be treated as a hybrid format. They could have pixel-specific dimensions as well as being derived from and representative of an image in a symbolic sense, without entirely separating the file as digital object from the visual image that appeared when the file was opened. So this is the grounds database. This is the second of our two datasets to be mapped. During the grounds building phase, there was a plan already in place to transform it to a linked data set by using the CRM, and it was kind of built with that in mind. So it references in places the AAT vocabulary, and it also shares the event-based structure that Raphael has. Efforts were made to standardize what could have otherwise been open input fields, so characteristics like color are limited by a drop-down interface. The grounds database is largely made up of gallery dataset, though there is information from other institutions, which means that its standardization can never be guaranteed. Data belonging to other institutions is often patchier than gallery data, and it won't have been held in the same structure. So the mapping needed to account for this disparity in input data by being flexible and reactive to its inputs in the design. So conceptually, it's similar to Raphael in that it's structured around an object, which represents a painting. Objects are linked to events, which are linked to people, time spans, samples, and so on. One key process that makes up much of the detail in grounds is sampling. So 3 tables in this diagram are devoted in their entirety to the examination and sub-examination of samples. So we had to learn how to deal with hierarchical subjects when we were mapping this, both in the context of the samples and in other tables where the idea of a parent appears. Additionally, the prominence of samples in the data would necessitate that attention be paid to how objects and their parts were represented in the CRM. The extension CRM-SCI became useful for us in expressing this. Oops, I went too far. No, I didn't. We were able to use a lot of the Raphael code to map grounds as well. So we broke up the mapping again into overlapping functions that taken together produce triples that describe the data in total. 7 basic categories make up the grounds mapping. Each of those has a corresponding mapping function, like the map object construct that I described in relation to Raphael. We produce SQL views because grounds is such a big data set. We had to break it down a little bit by making SQL views locally before we moved it into Python. We integrated those into data frames then, and those became the inputs of our mapping functions. Within the mapping functions, each of the data frames is looped through. Its values are passed to various triple creation functions, many of which are lifted wholesale from Raphael's code. PIDs are created for the values that need to persist, and newly created triples are loaded into a new graph, which is eventually output in XML or Turtle format. So the major distinction between the two datasets was the attention paid to samples within the grounds. This built on the image mapping already developed for Raphael. Samples were digitally imaged as well as mounted in resin and stored in a physical store, and the mapping needed to account for their imaging as well as the specific processes involved in their acquisition and storage. Splitting each sample into two ideas joined with a unifying PID enabled this. Along with the Raphael's image logic, CRM-SCI was used to build a new set of logic to describe the sampling and mounting process. CRM-SCI differentiates a sample from its sample site and expresses the change in state of an object as a result of having been sampled as an E13 attribute assignment, a construct familiar from base CRM. This attention to both the sample and the object from which it was taken became crucial to the mapping of the database that gave each of those things equal importance and weight. So the outputs of our project are available on a public website, which introduces the details of the two main datasets and provides both context and explanation for the work. I've given the URL of the website on this slide. Please feel free to take that down and access it in your own time. I just don't have time to demo it today. Access to both of the Sparkle endpoints has been provided with a simple user interface, with the current Sparkle query shown on the left and the result of the query on the right. The current query can also be edited as needed to create custom queries that can be executed within the same UI. A series of detailed example queries are provided for Raphael, allowing the user to see how the data can be explored and to document how the CIDOC-CRM has been used in this case. The examples range from requesting simple lists of entities to requesting more complex sets of data required to create a new interactive data presentation, particularly demonstrating how the images within the system can be surfaced and reused via the IIIF standard. And Joe's presentation will go into more detail on how we then visualize the data after it's produced. So this project's work not only connects two important gallery datasets together and provides a model for the further interlinking of future datasets, but also opens gallery data to collaboration with other cultural heritage institutions that hold CIDOC-CRM assets. As well as this, it provides an example of how scientific analytical work can become institutional knowledge. As assets are developed atop a CRM-based dataset, its content becomes integral to gallery presentation of the paintings within, and the results of scientific research can be made available in a simple format to the public. This also suggests the possibility of custom interfaces for researchers. By encoding detailed research data, this project creates numerous levels on which a user can engage with gallery content, which ought to be especially useful in a research context. These outcomes can have real impact on engagement and on the gallery's ongoing digital development, and demonstrate that making data fair has a positive effect on communities well beyond the target user base of a dataset. Thank you.
So thank you very much for Orla for this very informative and presentation. You have done really a big work. I just wanted to ask, what do you have next projects or data sets in mind already? Or?
Yes, I've actually left the gallery since this work was done. So I'm probably not on top of exactly what's going on there now, but as far as I understand, the plan for this was to provide a model for how the rest of the gallery's data could be mapped to CIDOC-CRM. I'm not sure what stage that broader project is at the moment, but I believe that that's the eventual plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. Do we have questions from the audience? Just wave me if you want to ask anything. Okay. If there are no questions at the moment, then I think we should go on with the next presentation. Thank you again, Orla. And if we
Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you have any questions later, then we can contact you.